Hey, my name's Caden and I want to thank you for joining us today. We hope this message inspires you, builds your faith, and gives you perspective to see God is moving in your life. Enjoy the message.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to worship online at Croix Church. I wonder how many of you noticed that when you get a new car, whether it's new or used, that all of a sudden you notice that a lot of your neighbors and other people in town have bought the car at the same time. It's like now you see that make and model everywhere, and before you never noticed it, but now all these other people have it. Have you ever noticed that? Well, the reality is they didn't just go buy that vehicle when you did. Those cars were there all along. It's just what? Your eyes have been opened to see what you weren't able to see before. So we know that. We've probably all experienced that. It actually has a name. There was two German guys came up with this. It's called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. And that is, their theory is that our brain is taking in so much information from so many different sources that if the brain doesn't sort of sift and decide what things are important, there'd be too much information and it would be just chaos for us to think about all these things at the same time. So our brains get selective about what they see. As we'll see, and I want to show you this video. It's kind of an old school video. Follow the instructions on the video and let's see what you see.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
Okay, that part is silent. Okay.
How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
So how about it? Did you get the right number of passes? Did you count to 15? Did you see the gorilla? Well, believe it or not, if you didn't, you're in good company because according as that test has been run, it's called the invisible gorilla test, by the way, 50% of folks who watch that video don't see the gorilla. They're too busy counting the number of passes. And that kind of illustrates the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon that our brains only take in so much stuff and we don't see everything. A couple weeks ago, we began a new series called Extraordinary. And what we're doing in this series is we're looking at the extraordinary life that Jesus calls us to, a life of love, based upon his command to love one another as he has loved us. And here's the reality, friends. When it comes to our brain and seeing, it's hard to love what you cannot see. And so the point I'd like to make in this message and in this talk is that love requires the miracle of sight. And what I want to do is look at a story in Luke's gospel. Only Luke tells this story about the miracle of sight. There are three main characters in this story found in Luke chapter 7. There is Jesus, of course, and then there is Simon the Pharisee and an unidentified woman. And I think what Luke is wanting us to see is to accurately see each of the people in this story. But really what he's wanting us to see is to see ourselves and others and Jesus more clearly. So I think the story is calling us to a few things and a life of love. First of all, to live this extraordinary life, it means seeing ourselves accurately. Verse 36, it says this, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. So Pharisees had this party and they invited Jesus to it. Later we learned that this particular Pharisee's name is Simon, and that he has invited Jesus to this party. Now he's a member of the Pharisees. Pharisees were a sect in Judaism. There were several sects. There was the Pharisees, there were the Sadducees, and then there were the Essenes, okay? And each of these had kind of distinct emphases. The Pharisees, literally, the word means the set apart ones, the separated ones, because they saw it as their mission to be separate from the sins of the world, to be separate from people who were outside of the covenant of Israel, to be separate from sinners, that this was sort of their life calling to be in the covenant of Abraham. Now, the Pharisees clashed often with Jesus. And in fact, they were largely responsible for his being arrested later in his ministry. Yet they weren't always the bad guys. I think that if we just see the Pharisees as bad guys, we paint with too broad of a brush and we don't see the whole story. We know that there were at least two Pharisees who were secret followers of Jesus, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. We also know that on some occasions in theological conversations that Jesus was having with religious leaders, that he sided with the Pharisees theologically on a number of occasions. They were the more conservative sect of Judaism, and the Sadducees were a little more liberal. And so Jesus had some things in common with them, but the Sadducees, not just in being kind of right on doctrine, the Sadducees had this approach to life that was problematic. You see, for them, the most important thing was being right, keeping the law, keeping the rules and the regulations in meticulous detail. And in doing so, what they wanted to be was in. There were those who were in the covenant in Abraham's children, the covenant with God, and there were those who were out. It was their lifelong goal to stay in covenant with God by keeping all of the rules. Well, this led to a legalistic approach to life. This led to looking at folks outside, people that they considered outside the bounds of the covenant, looking down on them. And so it created attitudes within the Pharisees towards other people that were far from loving. And the primary sin, you could say, the Pharisees battled with was pride. Because they could take great pride in their keeping the law and doing all the things that were required within the law. But they wanted to be right above everything else. Let me ask you a question. Are you a Pharisee? Well, after everything I just said, you may think, oh, that's not very flattering. I don't think I want to be one of them. But seriously, are you a Pharisee? Now, here's the reality. When it comes to stories in the Bible, as we read them, you know what our natural inclination is? We naturally identify with the heroes in the story and not with the villains. It's just sort of a natural thing. One person has called this Disney princess theology. It's like, I'm always Belle and never Gaston. I'm always Jasmine and never Jafar, always Simba and never Scar, always Cinderella and never the evil stepmother. So we do this with Bible stories. Like we identify, say, oh yeah, I can identify with Moses, but not stiff-necked, hard-hearted Pharaoh. Or maybe we can side with Abel and not Cain, who was filled with so much anger. Or we see ourselves as David, you know, the shepherd boy, and not Saul, the king who was rejected by God. If we're not careful, what we do is we kind of cast ourselves in these roles and we don't see ourselves accurately. And because we don't see ourselves accurately, we don't get the kind of help and grace we need for where we're at in our lives. So let me ask you again, are you a Pharisee? I put together some questions. This is not scientific in any stretch of the imagination, but I have 6 questions here, and I'm just going to ask you these questions. So if you would kind of keep tabs and just say yes or no, just simple yes or no questions, and keep track of how many times you say yes to these questions. So when you show up in the room, do people notice you and move toward you? Question 2, do you work in a profession that is generally respected? 3, have you been asked to be a reference for somebody else's job application? Number 4, is being right really important to you? 5, is being religious really important to you? Number 6, are you black and white and known for what you're against? If you answered yes to maybe 3 or more of those questions, I think it's pretty safe to say you're a Pharisee. If you answered yes to all 6 of those questions, you are the chief of Pharisees, my friend. Now, what we'll do in this story, though, we'll kind of naturally identify with the woman who comes with that gift of extravagant love and pours out her heart and her emotions onto Jesus. So let me ask you these questions. When you enter the room, do people whisper behind your back and kind of act like they don't see you? Number 2, are you generally embarrassed by the work that you do, the jobs that you've had? 3, are you ashamed of your educational background or the house you live in? 4, do you battle low self-esteem and feelings of worthlessness? Number 5, do you feel that if you entered a church building, the roof would collapse on top of you? And number 6, are you known for doing things religious people are against? You know, if you answered yes to 3 or more of those, maybe you really are the woman in this story, and that's your story. But I don't know about you. On those 6 questions about Pharisees, I answered yes to all 6 of them. Friends, I'm not just a Pharisee, I am the chief of Pharisees. Paul, who was the apostle who writes half of the New Testament, before he was that, he was Saul of Tarsus, and he called himself a Pharisee of Pharisees, the chief of sinners. Paul was able to find grace because he was able to see himself accurately. Do you see yourself accurately? I mean, as you really are, not as you think of yourself as, not Disney princess theology, but as you really are? And if so, you can find grace. I would suspect that there are more of us Pharisees who really need to lean in and listen to this story. In order to live this extraordinary life, we have to see, it begins by seeing ourselves accurately. Also means seeing others accurately. Verse 37, it says here, a woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. So enter this uninvited guest to the party that Simon the Pharisee is throwing for Jesus. Now, in that day, it was not unusual for people to walk in out of the street into someone's home when there's a banquet. Not that they would fully participate, but they just out of curiosity, people came in. The social structures of that day was not unusual. It was not scandalous at all that this woman entered the house. But it becomes scandalous when she approaches the rabbi. We're not given her name. We're not given her background, except that she lived a sinful life. Many Bible commentators believe that's code for she was a prostitute. She walked the streets. And again, we're not told the backstory, and it must have been a beautiful backstory, but somewhere along the way, this woman encountered Jesus, and she received grace from Jesus. She felt loved, maybe for the first time. She finds out that Jesus is in town and he's having this dinner, and she makes her way there, and she makes a beeline towards Jesus because she wants to express her love and appreciation and gratitude to this one, this religious leader of all people who actually accepted her and loved her, showed kindness to her. So, like I said, the fact that she's there isn't the scandal. The fact that she approaches a rabbi is. And the fact that she kind of makes herself the center of attention, that becomes problematic. When she gets close to Jesus, now in those days, they would lie down at the dinner table. They don't sit at chairs like we do. They would be lying down. Jesus' feet would be extended out. And she gets right up to Jesus, and she's overcome with emotion. And she kind of becomes this hot mess. I think it just overwhelms her, and she starts crying. She's kneeling there, she starts crying, and she's fumbling, trying to get this expensive jar of perfume that she has brought to anoint Jesus with, and she starts crying. And she's probably a little embarrassed that she started crying, and these tears, big tears, are dropping on the feet of Jesus, and she's embarrassed by this. And so she's saying, what am I going to do? I don't have anything to dry his feet with. So she pulls out the pin and lets her hair down and dries Jesus' feet with her hair. Everything she did in that scenario, in that whole sequence, was offensive to everybody else in the room. A, that she approached a rabbi. B, that she became the center of attention. And C, that she let her hair down. In those days, women only let their hair down in front of their husband. It would be considered erotic and scandalous for a woman to do that. She's not meaning to be erotic. She's just trying to respond to this situation. And then she finally gets to the perfume. And instead of pouring it on Jesus' head, which was a typical way to honor somebody, she doesn't feel she's worthy to do that. So she just pours the perfume on his feet. Such love, such devotion. It's a stirring scene. It's a beautiful scene. But unfortunately, Simon is being a Pharisee. He's being difficult about it. And in verse 39, it says, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, so he's thinking this, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Remember, Pharisees were the separated ones. Their mission in life was to stay separate from all of the brokenness and fallenness and sinfulness of the world. Because you see, if they were too close to a sinner, other people might somehow think that they were condoning of that person and their behavior, and they would never want to give that impression. And so he wants a bit of distance between himself and this woman, and he is absolutely offended that this rabbi, who people call a prophet, is allowing this woman with this reputation to touch him. It goes against everything that Simon holds dear, all of his values. And Jesus realizes that his dinner host needs his eyes open to really see clearly. And so he tells him a little parable. I'll just read it to you. Jesus answered him, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You've judged correctly, Jesus said. So it's a simple parable. 2 guys owe a lot of money. Say, we'll call it $100,000, and the other guy owes $10,000, and the banker is having a really good day and feeling really good, and he cancels the debts of both of them, and Jesus says, now who's going to love him more? It's obvious. I mean, the guy who has this huge debt, a year and a half or more, almost 2 years of wages, and he's forgiven. And this little story is a means to a miracle, to get Simon to see this woman clearly and accurately. And here, the next verse, I think you could say, is the pivot on which this whole story rotates and turns. Verse 44, it says, then he turned towards the woman. Luke is meaning here, there's a dramatic turn. He is turning toward the woman, okay? And he's looking at Simon and asks him a question. Do you see this woman? Seems like a obvious question, ridiculous question. Of course he saw the woman. He was offended by the woman. He was offended by her actions and all of that. But Jesus is talking about really seeing her. What did Simon see? He saw a sinner. He saw a rule breaker. He saw a person with a reputation. He saw a failure. Friends, There are a lot more to people than the sum total of their mistakes and sins. He did not see her. And Jesus is inviting the Pharisee, and he's inviting us to see people for who they really are in the eyes of God. So, put yourself in this story. Say we're the Pharisee, and Jesus is at our house. Who would come into your house and crash your party that would be offensive to you? You know, what group of people, what individuals do you find sort of offensive? And if they were in your house, suddenly you would be looking down your nose at them. And Jesus asked that same question. Do you see them? Do you really see this person? Maybe for you, it's an addict. Maybe for you, it's a selfish person. You just can't stand selfish people. Maybe it's your parents because you just don't understand your parents. There can be such gaps in generations, and they really bother you, and you just see the things about them that bother you. Maybe it's your kids. Let me ask you a question, kind of take a little bit of a rabbit trail here. If you're a parent, you have young children at home, or you had young children at home at one time, did you ever notice what would your kids do when you weren't listening to them or you weren't paying attention to them? I don't know about you, but in my household, I know you have a hard time believing this in a pastor's house that all of our kids are squeaky clean perfect, My kids would do something outrageous to get our attention. It's funny, my wife, who stayed home with the kids and raised our 4 children, had this capacity because I think she needed it as a coping mechanism. She could just tune the kids out, and they'd come up to her sometimes and they'd say, Mom, 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 Mom. And I'd be home sometimes and say, Linda, would you please answer him? And they would do the same to me when we get sort of distracted. I was reading the paper or watching TV, or you get on the phone. And what do kids do? Sometimes if you're really not listening to them, they'll just destroy something. They'll just start tearing the place up because what they're really saying is, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, listen to me. And we know that can get even more self-destructive in the teenage years, right? If a teenager doesn't feel heard, they may do some stuff that's outrageous. And what they're really doing is they're saying, hey, would somebody please listen to me? Would somebody see me? Let's take a situation in our culture right now. Since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May, there have been many, many protests in cities all across America, including our own. When you see the protesters, what do you see? You see criminals, maybe? Looters? Vandals? And yeah, nobody excuses any of that behavior. I've spoken with many black leaders who are so discouraged by that because it's taking attention away from the real message. But some of us, especially those of us in the majority community, all we see is what's wrong. 60 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King said, rioting is the language of the unheard. And he went on to say, social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. There is no other answer. Look, I'm not excusing at all the crazy behavior that's going on in Portland or Chicago or any of that stuff. I'm just saying, friends, look deeper than that. Look to the heart of those who are the peaceful protesters. Look to the heart of those who are marching. What are they saying? In typical Pharisee fashion, for a lot of my life, there's been racial tensions and protests and riots almost every decade of my long life now. And you know what I do? I just kind of roll my eyes and just say, goodness gracious, I don't understand it. About 6 years ago, God convicted me about this. So I began this journey of just simply speaking with Black Americans and just asking questions. It's called active listening, where you're listening to understand, not to come up with a response and debate. And I've just been doing a lot of listening because I realized I wasn't seeing the people. I wasn't hearing them. And you know, we just may have the answer in the church. Because what if we really listened? What if we leaned in towards the work that is so important to the heart of God of racial unity? What if we really began to listen to one another? Friends, we could offer this world, this country of ours, a tremendous gift just by listening. We honor people when we listen to them, when we see them. Jesus says, do you see this woman? And I think he says to us, do you see those protesters? Do you see, parents, do you see that child who's really, you think, gone off the deep end, or kids, do you see your parents who you just don't relate to? Do you see them? Do you listen? Living the extraordinary life requires that we see ourselves accurately, that we see others accurately. You see, Jesus didn't see just her sin and her failure. He saw her woundedness. He saw her need. He saw that she was a human being made in the very image of God. Well, like all the stories in the Gospels, this story helps us understand who Jesus is, and living the extraordinary life means seeing Jesus accurately. Remember Simon, he says, well, if this guy was a prophet, he'd know who was touching him. And Jesus reads his mind. Did you see that? He responds to him, his thoughts. He just proved, yeah, he's a prophet. He's more than a prophet. In fact, he goes on to forgive this woman. Notice that the Pharisees would be so worried about giving the impression that they would be condoning somebody's sin that they would not draw near to a sinner. But Jesus was never afraid to draw near to sinners. He was called a friend of sinners, but he never condoned the sin. He says, her sins, though they are many, are forgiven. He's the one who opens our eyes. And he says, Simon, she is able to show such extravagant love because she has received such extravagant grace. You see, people who have received the forgiveness of God are able to show great love because they've been given great love. I believe Jesus is the one who opens our eyes. Friends, if you hang around Jesus long enough, you will see people you've never seen before. You will hear people that you've never heard before. And you will love people that you've never loved before. That's the difference that Jesus makes in our lives. Well, love requires the miracle of sight, that we would truly see one another, that we would truly see those who are hurting in our midst. A couple weeks ago when we began the series, we threw out this little challenge called Give Me Five. It's not giving me five, just a figure of speech, saying this week, since you can't serve within the church building or maybe the typical way that you normally serve in some sort of form or fashion is not available to you right now, what if you find simple ways of serving people through the week and just kind of keep track of that? Do some secretly so they don't even know they're being served. Here's two things. What if, like this woman, you were to show extravagant love towards Jesus in worship and offer prayers of gratitude and thanksgiving? What if you were to sit down with somebody that you would normally look down your nose at and listen to them and really see them and give them this wonderful gift of hearing them? That'd be amazing. That would be extraordinary. Because when we really see, when we have this miracle of sight, we are given the capacity to love with a love that is divine, a love that is transforming. Again, if you hang around Jesus long enough, you'll see people you've never seen before. You'll hear people that you've never heard before, and you'll love people that you've never loved before. And that would be extraordinary. Let's pray. Lord, Jesus, you just continue to amaze us, Lord, as we see how you loved, how you really saw this woman for who she was, not just her mistakes and her failures and her sins, but who she really was. Give us that kind of grace. Give us eyes to see. Give us ears to hear. Give us a heart to love. And just as this woman loved greatly because she was forgiven, may we be a people who love much because we have been forgiven much. Give us eyes to see, we pray. Amen.
If you enjoyed today's message, make sure to like and subscribe. Feel free to share this with others that God has put on your heart. And to learn more about LaCroix Church or to find your next steps, head to lacroixchurch.org. Thanks again for checking us out, and we hope to see you soon.